the town. Like you said, unexpected, off the beaten path. Also, you just pull off the Levee Road into the place, and it's like you step back in time. And as far as you said, 90 amazes me because when I went through it during the day, I saw maybe one person out. It almost seemed like it was deserted then, and you can go traipsing, especially through some of the homes way in the back and around, and they look like they should be condemned. Some of them did anyway, and yet they were lived in or being rented out. And can you tell us, I guess, start off for people who are going to end up watching this, what is Chinese Camp, and lead up to maybe how it was preserved and set aside. I know you mentioned the descendant of the major landholder, and I remember reading about that at that, I think it's like the visitor center. And when you first drive in, it's off to the left, I think, or that's one of the bigger buildings in the town.
Yeah, there's a post office, and there's an old post office that's no longer open. There's a post office, and then there's the Chinese Camp store, which is kind of the main hub of the area. But and so that's where all the locals gather, and it used to be an even bigger gathering place. At one point in time, Chinese Camp had about roughly 5,000 people back in the gold rush days, and that's when it was founded. It was founded in 1848, just at the start of the gold rush, and they found gold on the creek that's just to the east of there, and so people started coming down there, and a lot of Chinese folks started coming down there. There was at the time, in the early 1850s, a tax that was levied on foreign miners, and primarily aimed at Chinese and to some extent Latin American miners, but primarily Chinese miners. So you had to pay $20 to mine your land for a 20 by 20 lot or claim, and so this was not enforced as much down in Chinese Camp. It was enforced up in Sonora, and so there was a lot of movement from Sonora down to Chinese Camp of the Chinese folks, and so it became known as Chinese Camp because the majority of the people there were Chinese. There were two sides of town. There was one side that was to the east, that was the white 49er side of town, and to the west was the Chinese Chinatown, which is no longer there. Unfortunately, that's all been burned down in successive fires, so you can't really see the Chinese section, but it constituted roughly half the town at one time.
So the section that's there right now is not the Chinese section?
It is not. It is the 49er white section. The main street is the main street that you go on.
Yeah, I had no idea. Because isn't there like a little, I remember there being a garden area with a plaque that was dedicated to the Chinese family that actually purchased the land and kind of set it aside and saved it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are plaques around there. There's one plaque that's right by the entrance to the town. There's another plaque that's down about 4 or 5 miles south of town, which is a real interesting site. It's it was what was called the Crimea House, and they had back in the day these houses, so-called, set up that were way stations for people, wagon train people coming through with gold or goods or agricultural materials, stuff like that. So these way stations, one of them was this Crimea House. It was originally called the Kentucky House because it was set up there by a guy who was from Kentucky. And later on, during the Crimean War, it became known as the Crimea House. And this was the site in 1856, I believe, 1856, of the first Tong War in California. There were roughly 2,100 people on one side and 1,300 people on the other side, all Chinese from two warring factions who both had a beef with each other over a claim. Evidently, a rock had rolled off of one person's claim, one group's claim, onto the other group's claim. And it's not really clear whether the rock itself had gold in it and there was a dispute over that, or they were just upset that the rock rolled over there and they were like, hey, we have an excuse to start a fight. But the fight was this big war that they got together on a Sunday afternoon. As I said, about 3,000 or 4,000 people. And one side paid roughly $40,000 to arm themselves with rifles from San Francisco. They got themselves trained by people who used to be in the Army, and some of those people were actually fought under the guise of being Chinese, even though they weren't, for that side.
Wow.
And there was this big to-do, and it was the kind of the defining moment of that year, and that was the biggest year in town. That was the year the town reached its kind of its apex of importance with 1856.
It almost seems like Big Trouble in Little China pulled a page from history with their Tong. I think they even called it the Tong Warrior or something like that in the movie.
Yeah.
I think I had no idea. Paul, you were about to say something. I'm sorry.
Oh, no. Stephen, who are some of the notables that would visit Chinese camp?
Well, there were stories that Joaquin Murrieta came through there,
Right.
and that he at one point held up a person and took his horse in that area. And of course, he was originally active up in the Placerville area, which is to the north of that, and in the Sonora area. And then, as they got wise to him and they started chasing him, he went south, and he went south through Chinese camp, and eventually went over to Corsebold, where he was ultimately apprehended and beheaded. So on his way through, he stopped in Chinese camp.
And some of the stories that I heard when HPI Haunted Paranormal Investigations went to Chinese camp, some of the locals told us that Joaquin Murrieta, who was the inspiration for Zorro, would come into Chinese camp. Three Finger Jack, they said he was also there. And who else did they say that was there? Black Bart, the
Right.
gentleman bandit. Yeah.
Yeah.
And did you hear the same thing?
There was there was actually a written record of him coming. Actually, it was an oral story by someone who lived in the time, and he was the store owner of the store that's there on the corner that used to be the post office. And he sold candy out of his general store, and Black Bart would come in and buy candy because he had a sweet tooth.
Oh.
And so he was a gentleman there too. He was not. No one knew who he was until he was finally unmasked after he did, I think, 28 robberies up and down in a 3-year period in the 1880s.
And how in the heck did Black Bart, like everybody was riding a horse, and they said Black Bart would go from point A to point B, and he walked. So that was just kind of crazy in itself. But when we did our investigation at Chinese camp, we did get some EVPs, electronic voice phenomenon. So the place is definitely haunted. Ghost Adventures was very much interested in investigating Chinese camp. And there was one piece of property, private property, that they couldn't figure out who the owner was. And because of that, they couldn't film over there.
Do you recall what property it was?
No, I don't.
There is one. I mean, every place there looks haunted to me, and as you said, it is a charming town. When the sun is shining on it and everything. When we came upon it at first, it was an overcast day late in the day, and it just looked spooky as all get out. And I'm not normally spooked. I don't get that kind of a vibe very much for places. And just as a little bit of personal background, my wife is a paranormal investigator herself.
Oh, okay.
And has been to a number of these places. And so she went to a haunted asylum back in Iowa. She's been to Binion's Casino down in Vegas, and a number of haunted hotels. And she has these experiences where she does have, she set up EVPs and other bits of equipment, and she does have experiences of encounters with the paranormal. The funny thing is since we've gotten married, we've been married 2 years, I've gone with her to all these different places like the Jackson House Hotel in Eureka, Nevada, which is supposed to be hugely haunted. And in fact, we went there, and it wasn't even open to the public. We made a reservation, but we had to go up the street a mile to the other hotel that owns this hotel to check in. And we went in and we went to the front desk, and we said, we have a reservation at the Jackson House Hotel for tonight. And the person said, you do? I said, yeah, you guys own the hotel, right? And she said, yes, we do. I wouldn't go there myself.